It was supposed to be an ordinary Monday in northern Leech County, Texas. Just sunrise over an empty dirt road, dust hanging in the air, the rumble of a county truck heading to fill potholes. The men inside had driven this same stretch hundreds of times. But this time, something stopped them cold. Lying just beyond the shoulder, half hidden by mesquite and tall grass, was something that didn't belong. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, a cruel illusion that first responders know too well. But when the driver stepped closer, the color drained from his face. It wasn't plastic. It was human. 21-year-old Linda Treviño Carbajal. Left in the dirt like the world had decided she didn't matter. Within minutes, sheriff's units flooded the road. Yellow tape snapped in the wind. Radios hissed. The Texas sun rose higher, revealing bruises, footprints, and the violence written into the earth itself. Reporters gathered. The sheriff's voice shook as he confirmed what everyone feared. Homicide. Word spread fast across diners, church pews, and dusty gas stations. And then the whisper turned into something colder. It's happened before. Less than a year earlier, Cynthia Joanne Palasio, Linda's roommate, had been found strangled in another remote corner of this same county. 2 women. 2 friends. 2 crime scenes connected by silence. For years, the case would grow colder, buried under layers of dust and unanswered prayers, until DNA would finally whisper a name that Texas had waited 17 years to hear. But justice? Justice would never come the way anyone expected. If this happened in your town, would you call that justice, or just an ending? Drop a comment with your country and your local time, and stay with us for this journey through one of Texas's most haunting cold case files. The heat came early that morning, settling over northern Leech County like a heavy breath. Sheriff's deputies stood at the edge of the dirt road, their boots sinking into dry clay, faces drawn tight against the rising sun. Flashing lights painted the mesquite trees in red and blue. A camera clicked again and again, small, clinical sounds that didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. Detective Alan Pierce arrived just after Ada. The taste of black coffee still bitter in his mouth. He'd been here before, different road, different victim. But this one felt the same. He ducked under the yellow tape, nodding at the deputies who couldn't meet his eyes. The body lay just beyond the ditch, the earth disturbed, tire tracks pressed into the soil like scars. Female, early 20s, a crime scene tech murmured. In signs of strangulation. No ID yet. 8s. Pierce didn't need one. He'd recognize that dark hair anywhere. Linda Treviño Carbajal, missing only 24 hours, now silent forever. He exhaled hard through his nose, the way cops do when words won't come. Around him, the investigation machine moved with grim precision. Evidence markers bloomed like yellow flowers. Gloves snapped. Radios hissed. Each step documented, each breath measured. Evidence carefully logged, one more entry in the growing archive of Texas cold case files. At a distance, the road crew who'd found her stood together by their truck, not talking, just staring. Their hands still dirty with the dust of their ordinary work. One of them kept ringing his cap like a prayer, whispering the same words over and over. We didn't mean to find her. 8s. By noon, the first news van had arrived. Reporters with tight smiles and practiced sympathy set up cameras beside the county road sign. Behind them, townspeople gathered in small, uneasy clusters. Nobody said her name yet, but everyone already knew. In places like Leech County, news doesn't travel, it seeps, through grocery aisles and gas pumps, through whispers traded across church parking lots. Inside the sheriff's office, The air smelled of burnt coffee and copier toner. Detectives pinned photos to corkboard, drawing red lines between names, dates, and coordinates. The map looked like a wound spreading outward. You remember where you were when the sirens cut through a normal morning. 8s. Maybe you were sipping coffee at the kitchen table, or standing at the pump watching the county trucks fly past. Maybe you didn't even know Linda personally, but now her face will never leave your mind. That's how fear spreads here. Not fast, but deep. By evening, the small town of Loch felt like a room where someone had turned off all the lights. Parents called daughters who hadn't checked in. Husbands watched wives walk to their cars. Every woman in the county had someone waiting up that night. The thought of Linda out there, alone, haunted everyone. In a small white house on Birchwood Street, Linda's mother sat at her kitchen table, the blinds drawn tight against the sunset. Her hands trembled on a styrofoam cup of untouched coffee. A deputy had just left, his words still echoing. "We found her." 8s. She'd repeated them back to him, as if by saying the words aloud, she could make them untrue. Her younger daughter stood frozen in the doorway, face pale, unable to cry. Their home, once filled with noise and music, felt hollow now, like it knew something terrible had happened. At the sheriff's department, Pierce worked past midnight. He went over the timeline again, where Linda had been last seen, the route she might have taken home, who she'd spoken to. The walls seemed to close in with each unanswered question. Somewhere in those gaps lived the person who had done this. He could feel it. One of the junior deputies, barely 23, stood outside smoking a cigarette down to the filter. "Sir," he said quietly, "do you think it's the same guy? The one from last year?" 8s. Pierce didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was enough. As darkness settled over the county, the flashing lights faded, and the road crew's tracks were replaced by those of crime scene vehicles heading home. But the imprint of that day would stay, etched into asphalt, memory, and the quiet spaces people tried not to think about. In homes across Leech County, televisions murmured updates between weather reports and baseball scores. Young woman found murdered. Investigation ongoing. The words rolled off anchors' tongues like routine, but in living rooms, people sat frozen, coffee growing cold, listening to the rain start against their windows. Fear has a sound in small towns. It's the click of locks that used to stay open, the whisper of curtains pulled shut before dark. And grief? Grief sounds like silence on a road where laughter used to echo. The detectives wouldn't know it yet, but they had already touched every clue they'd need. It would just take 17 years and a revolution in science before those small, forgotten details spoke again. That day, under a relentless Texas sun, they bagged soil, fibers, traces of life and death, all the quiet evidence that would someday tell the truth no one could see. And somewhere in Leech County, the killer slept soundly, knowing he was still invisible. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. We uncover real cold case files every week. That night, the town of Loch didn't sleep. Windows stayed lit long past midnight. People spoke in whispers, even behind closed doors, as if the killer might somehow hear. Fear had moved in quietly, unpacking itself inside every home. But in one small house on Birchwood Street, the silence was different. It wasn't fear, it was grief, raw and immediate. The kind that steals the air right out of a room. Linda Treviño Carbajal had been 21. She loved loud country music, the kind you play in a beat-up Chevy with the windows down. She'd been saving for community college, working double shifts at the diner off Route 19. Everyone remembered her laugh, bright, contagious, the sound that made a bad day better. Her friends said she was the kind of girl who always looked out for others. If someone's car broke down, Linda showed up with jumper cables before you could even ask. Her dream was to become a teacher, to teach kids how to be good humans. She once told her mother. Now, her name was on a manila evidence folder. Detective Pierce pinned her photo beside another, the one of Cynthia Joanne Palasio. The resemblance between their smiles made him stop for a moment. Two young women, roommates, both vibrant, both full of plans. And now, both gone. Cynthia had been 23. She worked at a small grocery store downtown and took night classes in business management. She talked often about opening a Mexican cafe someday, maybe with her cousin as the cook. She loved animals, volunteered at the local shelter, and sent birthday cards to her grandmother every year without fail. When Cynthia was murdered in 2003, it had shaken the town. But a year later, life had begun to creep back toward normal. People wanted to believe it had been random, something dark that passed through and left again. Linda's death shattered that illusion. By sunrise the next morning, the detectives knew they weren't facing two separate tragedies. They were facing a pattern. Investigators realized they were now dealing with two intertwined cold case files. Eights. Pierce drew a red line between their photos, connecting two lives that had already been connected by friendship. He stared at the wall of faces, friends, co-workers, boyfriends, anyone who might link the two victims. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the ticking of an old wall clock. Outside, the news spread faster than the sheriff's office could contain it. Two women, both strangled, both found alone. The story grew legs, moving from whispers to headlines, from concern to panic. At the diner where Linda had worked, customers sat in silence, coffee cups cooling in their hands. Someone muttered, "She served me breakfast last week." Another said, "Cynthia used to bag my groceries." These weren't strangers from the nightly news. They were neighbors. If it were your friend, you'd start checking every shadow twice. You'd glance over your shoulder in the parking lot, double lock the door, keep the porch light on all night. You'd tell yourself that evil like this doesn't live here, but deep down, you'd stop believing that. For Linda's mother, time stopped the moment detectives said her daughter's name in the past tense. But grief doesn't stay still. It moves. It morphs. It becomes ritual. She washed the coffee cup Linda had left in the sink, dried it, and set it back exactly where it had been. Every morning, she brewed 2 cups instead of 1. One for her, one for the daughter who'd never drink it again. At night, she walked into Linda's room and whispered prayers she wasn't sure anyone heard. She left the light on, always the light, as if Linda might somehow find her way home again. Cynthia's family knew that pain too. They had tried to warn Linda, gently, that the world wasn't always kind. But who wants to live guarded at 21? They had attended Linda's vigil, standing beside the Carbajals in the flickering candlelight, feeling the same knife twist of déjà vu. At the church service that week, the pastor spoke about faith and the long shadow of evil. But outside, people weren't talking about faith. They were talking about fear. Someone swore they'd seen a white truck parked near both crime scenes. Someone else claimed a drifter had been working odd jobs around town. Rumors bred like wildfire, each one feeding the next. The sheriff's department tried to control the narrative, but small towns have long memories and short patience. Every unanswered question became an accusation. At the grocery store, mothers shopped in pairs. At night, husbands walked wives to their cars. Teenagers who used to roam country roads after dark now stayed home. The trust that had once tied Locke together had frayed. Inside the sheriff's office, Pierce tried to stay focused. He laid out timelines, re-interviewed witnesses, rechecked evidence from both crime scenes. The files multiplied, thicker by the day. He barely went home. Some nights he sat in his car outside Linda's house, just staring at the porch light her mother never turned off. He told himself it was to understand the geography of the case. But deep down, he knew it was guilt. Because what haunted him wasn't just that the killer was still out there, it was that he might have already met him. The human mind tries to build patterns out of chaos. It's how detectives survive, and how grief destroys. Pierce started dreaming of dirt roads and flashlights cutting through fog. He'd wake up sweating, convinced he'd missed something obvious. And maybe he had. In the months that followed, both families tried to move forward, but there's no real moving on, only forward with absence. Linda's younger sister stopped taking the road where her body had been found. Her father went back to work at the feed store, pretending life was normal, pretending not to flinch every time the phone rang. Cynthia's parents moved away that summer, leaving their daughter's childhood home behind because every corner whispered her name. They sent Christmas cards to the Carbajals, each one signed with the same message. We still believe. Eights. The investigation pushed on. Door knocks, polygraphs, dead ends. But every path led nowhere. Each time Pierce thought he had something, it dissolved under scrutiny. The press called it the Locke County murders. The sheriff called it ongoing. The families called it hell. By the 1-year anniversary of Linda's death, the town held another vigil. Fewer people came this time, but those who did held their candles higher, their faces streaked with tears and determination. The pastor spoke again, softer now, about how justice moves slowly but surely. In the front row, Linda's mother whispered to Cynthia's mother, "We'll wait, as long as it takes." Eights. Behind them, the detectives stood in uniform, silent sentinels against the wind. They couldn't promise justice, only that they'd never stop chasing it. The flickering candles reflected in their eyes looked like tiny flames of guilt. Years later, those same photos, Linda and Cynthia, side by side, would hang in the cold case office, yellowed at the edges, waiting for the technology that would finally give them a voice again. But, for now, they were just two young women whose laughter had vanished from a Texas town too small to forget them, and too wounded to move on. If you believe victims deserve to be remembered for their lives, not just their deaths, hit like... By the fall of 2004, Leach County had become a place defined by fear and unanswered questions. Patrol cars lingered longer on back roads. Porch lights burned all night. At the sheriff's department, the murder board had grown into a wall of ghosts, photos, maps, notes, all threaded together by red string and desperation. Detective Alan Pierce sat alone in his office most nights, the hum of fluorescent lights above him, a styrofoam cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He stared at the board until the faces blurred, then started again. You stare at photos until faces blur, promising yourself you'll find the link. The case had turned his life into a loop of interviews, reports, and late-night drives. He still saw Linda's smile every time he closed his eyes, not as a victim, but as a reminder. He'd promised her mother they would find who did it. That promise had started as duty. It had become obsession. The first few months of the investigation were relentless. Detectives traced both women's routines down to the smallest detail. Who they saw, where they worked, who they talked to. They interviewed boyfriends, co-workers, family friends, even the delivery drivers from Linda's diner. Dozens of statements filled binders. Nothing pointed to a suspect. In theory, the the similarities between the two murders should have made things easier. Both victims were young, female, strangled, and left in remote areas. But that was the problem. The similarities were too broad. The pattern fit a dozen possible offenders and ruled out none. The crime scenes offered traces but no faces. Partial footprints. Tire treads too faint to trace. One cigarette butt. A few strands of hair that didn't match either victim. Each piece of evidence was logged, sealed, stored. Those samples sat frozen for years among thousands of cold case files, waiting for science to catch up. Eights. Pierce didn't know it yet, but those tiny fragments of DNA, invisible, inert, almost forgotten, would someday break the case wide open. For now, the evidence felt like a taunt. The lab could only do so much in 2004. DNA testing was improving, but databases were limited, and only convicted offenders were cataloged. Without a match, the data was just static. Pierce filled the void with motion. He revisited both crime scenes again and again, walking the perimeter until the terrain felt like memory. He noticed the same details repeating: an old fence post, a discarded beer bottle, the way the road curved just enough to hide a car from sight. He started driving that stretch every few nights, headlights cutting through the dark, searching for something that wasn't there. Other detectives worried about him. One of them, a young officer named Ramirez, found him asleep in his car one morning, crime scene photos spread across the dashboard. "You can't live inside this case," Ramirez said gently. Pierce didn't answer. He already did. The families kept calling. Every month or so, Linda's mother would leave a message at the department, polite, patient, but with a tremor under her words. "Just checking," she'd say. "Anything new?" Eights. Cynthia's father called less often, but when he did, he was blunt. Find him before he does it again. Eights. Pierce kept their photos on his desk, beside the stack of reports. Sometimes he spoke to them when no one was around, as if they were still listening. "We're getting closer," he'd whisper. But he wasn't sure anymore if he believed it. Meanwhile, the killer stayed invisible. Whoever he was, he blended in perfectly. No one remembered anything strange. No one noticed anyone following them. The very ordinariness of life in Locke County had become the killer's camouflage. Profilers from the state police reviewed the case in early 2005. Their assessment chilled Pierce. The killer, they said, likely knew both women, not well, but enough to approach without alarming them. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient, controlled. Someone who planned carefully, perhaps revisiting the crime scenes afterward. They called it a control fantasy. Strangulation, the profiler explained, takes time. It requires closeness, eye contact. It's not about rage, it's about domination. The killer didn't just want to end their lives. He wanted to decide when it happened. Pierce thought about that often. The idea that someone capable of such control could live among them, shopping in the same stores, attending the same church services, was unbearable. The community began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Every rumor became a theory. Every friendly face could be a mask. One man who dated Cynthia briefly moved away after neighbors whispered too loudly. Another man, a co-worker of Linda's, was questioned 3 times and then quit his job, unable to bear the stares. Fear had made everyone both victim and suspect. Pierce's wife noticed the change in him. He'd stopped coming home before midnight, stopped talking at dinner, started keeping a stack of case files beside their bed. One night she told him quietly, "You can't bring their ghosts into this house." He didn't respond. He just picked up his keys and went back to the office. In 2006, after 2 years of dead ends, the sheriff reassigned parts of the case to younger detectives, hoping new eyes might help. Pierce stayed as lead, but felt time slipping through his hands like sand. The new detectives were eager, methodical, but to him, their optimism felt naive. He'd seen too many cases fade into silence. That summer, a promising lead emerged, a man arrested in another county for assault, with connections to both victims through a mutual friend. For weeks, Pierce thought they had him. But DNA from the scene didn't match. Another dead end. When the results came back negative, Pierce didn't even react. He just folded the paper, placed it in the file, and said softly, "Next." Eights. The weight of failure pressed on everyone. The sheriff called fewer briefings. Reporters stopped showing up. Public attention drifted elsewhere. The case didn't close, but it stopped living. By 2007, the files were boxed and moved to storage, shelves of quiet grief stacked behind metal doors. Pierce visited them sometimes, tracing the case numbers with his fingers. Each box held fragments of 2 lives, and the question that had consumed him: why them? He imagined the killer somewhere out there, watching the news fade, realizing he'd gotten away with it. Maybe he was married now. Maybe he went to barbecues, laughed at jokes, waved to neighbors. Maybe he walked past the victims' families at the grocery store and they never even knew. You think about that, the possibility that he's still here, that he never left. The idea gnawed at Pierce until sleep became impossible. He began keeping a notebook filled with every unanswered question, every tiny inconsistency. He drew timelines, rechecked witness statements, compared language patterns in interviews. If the killer had slipped once, even in a word, Pierce meant to find it. But obsession has a price. His health deteriorated. He lost weight. He stopped calling his wife back. When she finally left, she told him, "You care more about the dead than the living." Eights. Maybe she was right. Still, he couldn't stop. Because even when the rest of the world forgot, he knew someone had taken 2 young women's lives and vanished into ordinary daylight. In 2008, a memo came down from the state lab. New DNA testing methods were becoming available, more sensitive, more precise. For the first time in years, hope flickered. Pierce reopened the evidence box himself. The plastic bags were brittle with age, the labels fading. He signed the chain of custody log, hands shaking slightly as he sent the samples for reanalysis. He told no one, not even the families. He'd learned not to promise what he couldn't deliver. Then, for weeks, he waited. And in that waiting, something changed. He realized he was no longer chasing a killer. He was chasing redemption. Not for Linda or Cynthia, not even for justice, but for himself. When the call finally came from the lab, the technician's voice was cautious. "We got something," she said. Not a match, not yet, but something clearer, stronger, more complete than before. A profile. A footprint of identity, waiting for a name. Pierce closed his eyes. For the first time in 4 years, he smiled. It wasn't victory, but it was movement. And movement was enough to keep the promise alive. Comment "Fund the labs" if you believe no family should wait decades for answers. Every advancement in science turns silence into truth and gives hope to the next family still waiting for justice. The years that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet that weighs more than noise. In Leach County, time didn't heal, it just layered dust over pain. The case file thickened, the ink faded, and the world moved on, but not everyone had that luxury. Detective Alan Pierce stayed in the sheriff's department even as others transferred or retired. He refused to leave the board that still held the faces of Linda Treviño Carbajal and Cynthia Joanne Palasio. Their photos had yellowed slightly at the edges, but he couldn't bring himself to replace them. Replacing them felt like erasing them. He stopped counting the years. He counted anniversaries instead. Every April, Linda's mother sent a handwritten letter to the department. Not demanding, not angry, just a reminder that her daughter existed. Sometimes she wrote about Linda's favorite country songs, or about her younger sister who still couldn't bring herself to visit the gravesite. Sometimes she just wrote thank you for not forgetting her. Pierce kept every letter in a folder marked personal. He read them when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights. Cynthia's parents had moved to another county by then, but every Christmas, they mailed a card to the Carbajals. "We still believe," they always wrote. The two families, once connected by friendship, were now bound by tragedy. The sheriff's department had fewer resources for old cases. New crimes demanded attention. Budgets were tight, labs overworked, DNA tests expensive. The case lingered in limbo, not closed, not active, just suspended between hope and bureaucracy. In 2010, a new detective fresh out of Dallas named Marissa Valdez joined the team. She was sharp, methodical, and young enough to still believe in miracles. She found the old files one afternoon, stacked neatly in the archive room. She carried them to her desk like relics. "Why are these still here?" she asked. Pierce didn't look up from his paperwork. "Because they're not solved," he said. Valdez opened the boxes and began to read. She saw the same evidence logs, the same photos, the same typed reports that had haunted Pierce for years. But to her, they weren't history, they were puzzles. She noticed things others had overlooked. Inconsistencies in witness statements, minor discrepancies in time stamps, unexplored connections between Linda's workplace and the rural route where Cynthia was found. For weeks, she followed the old leads as if they were new. But soon, the same wall Pierce had hit years before loomed in front of her. Without new evidence, she was chasing ghosts. She found Pierce sitting alone late one night, the crime board still glowing under a single desk lamp. "How do you keep doing this?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I promised them," he said simply. She nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. That was the curse of detectives who worked cold case files. They didn't solve crimes. They carried them. Outside, the town of Locke had changed. New businesses opened, old ones closed. Children grew up and left. The younger generation barely remembered the fear that had once gripped their parents. But for the families, nothing changed. Grief had become their identity. It shaped their routines, their conversations, their sense of self. Linda's mother turned her daughter's bedroom into a shrine. The walls stayed the same soft blue. The hairbrush, the framed photos, the folded clothes, untouched for years. When relatives visited, she'd open the door, stand silently in the doorway, and then close it again. Cynthia's father, aging faster than he should, planted 2 oak trees behind his house, one for each girl. Every spring, he trimmed them carefully, whispering prayers as he worked. Life went on, but it no longer felt like living. It felt like waiting. You hold a candle. The wax burns your hand, but you don't blow it out. The vigil had become tradition now, every April for Linda, every July for Cynthia. People still came, though fewer each year. Some came because they remembered. Others came because forgetting felt like betrayal. On those nights, the churchyard glowed with 100 small flames. The wind moved gently through them, scattering the light across faces worn by years of loss. Pierce stood in the back, out of uniform, hands in his pockets. He never spoke, but he always came. The families knew. That was enough. He'd watched Linda's mother step up to the microphone, her voice steady at first, then breaking. Eights. She was kind. She loved to dance. She made people laugh. Eights. Every year, the same words. Every year, they hurt the same way. Sometimes, when the pastor spoke about faith and forgiveness, Pierce would look up at the stars and wonder if God had a statute of limitations. By 2011, Linda would have been 28. The thought haunted her mother. She imagined her daughter married, maybe a teacher, just like she dreamed. Instead, all that was left were photographs and anniversaries. Cynthia's parents came less often now. Age and distance made travel harder. But they always sent flowers, always called the sheriff's office on the same day each year. Inside the department, Valdez pushed for renewed DNA testing, but budgets delayed it. She argued with superiors, filed requests, wrote memos no one read. The world had changed. Smartphones, social media, new technology everywhere, yet justice still moved at a crawl. For nearly a decade, it remained one of Texas's most haunting cold case files. By 2013, the vigils had grown smaller still. The candles flickered against an emptier backdrop, but the resolve burned the same. Pierce noticed that new people attended now, students, younger officers, people who hadn't been there when it began. Maybe that was hope, he thought, not in solving the case, but in remembering it. But remembering has its own pain. Because when years pile up like sediment, memories erode, witnesses die, evidence degrades, even grief changes shape. It becomes quieter, more private. Some nights, Linda's mother would drive past the courthouse and whisper to herself, "We're still here." "Are you?" Eights. Inside the department, Pierce's hair had gone gray. Valdez had become the lead on new cases. The old files stayed on her shelf, never forgotten, never fully alive. Sometimes, when she walked past the evidence room, she'd stop and stare at the labels. 2003, Palasio, Cynthia Joanne. 2004, Carbajal, Linda Treviño. It felt like a cemetery for paper ghosts. Pierce retired in 2014. On his last day, he packed his things, leaving the 2 photos pinned on the board. He told Valdez, "You'll know when it's time. The case will tell you." Eights. She didn't understand then. Years later, she would. Because some cases don't end, they just wait. And waiting can feel like punishment. In 2015, the county held what would be the final public vigil. The pastor was older now, the crowd smaller. But when Linda's mother took the microphone one last time, her voice carried through the quiet. Eights. 17 years is too long to wait for justice. But I will wait anyway. Eights. The candles trembled in the wind. You hold a candle. The wax burns your hand, but you don't blow it out. Because blowing it out feels like giving up. If someone you love is still missing, share this episode. Our Cold Case Files community stands with you. Together, we remember so no one has to wait in silence. By 2018, the Leach County murders had faded from most headlines, buried beneath newer tragedies. But in the small evidence room of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the past was still waiting, sealed in numbered envelopes, frozen in stainless steel freezers humming quietly against the walls. The samples had been stored for nearly 17 years. Soil, fibers, biological traces that, back in 2004, were too faint, too degraded, too old for the science of that time. But science had caught up. When the state announced new funding for advanced DNA sequencing, Detective Marisa Valdez was one of the first to apply. She'd been working cold cases for years now, carrying Pierce's old files like sacred texts. Her voice trembled when she called Linda's mother. "We're retesting the evidence," she said softly. The other end of the line was quiet for a moment, then a whisper. "Does that mean there's still a chance?" Ace. Hope was a fragile thing, and after so many years, even hope could hurt. At the DPS lab in Austin, a forensic technician named Rachel Harmon signed in the samples. She'd processed hundreds of cases, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the handwriting on the evidence tags, faded, precise, careful. Maybe it was the date. April 2004. A lifetime ago. She placed the samples under a biosafety hood, gloved hands steady but heart racing. Old evidence was like archaeology, fragile, sacred, unforgiving. One mistake could erase the past forever. As the machine began its slow whirring sequence, Rachel stared through the glass, watching fragments of human history swirl in digital silence. She knew better than to expect a miracle. Old DNA often failed to amplify. Contamination could ruin everything. And still, she hoped. You watch the printer spit out a single name, and your hands start to shake. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, almost anticlimactic. The software pinged, the printer rattled, and out slid a single page, just one word highlighted in bold. Castillo, Andy. Rachel froze. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She reread the data, double-checked every identifier, every genetic marker. It matched perfectly. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone. "Detective Valdez, you'd better come down here." When Valdez arrived at the lab, Rachel was still pale, still gripping the printout like scripture. "I ran it 3 times, she said. "Same result every time." "Eights." Valdez stared at the name, reading it over and over as if letters might rearrange themselves. Andy Castillo. A name that had lived on the edges of the case years ago, mentioned in passing, interviewed once, dismissed for lack of evidence. A man who had lived quietly in Leech County during both murders, then moved away, forgotten like a shadow after sundown. After 17 years, a name finally rose from the depths of cold case files. Andy Castillo. "Eights." Valdez leaned back against the lab wall, heart pounding. 17 years of silence. 17 years of faces fading, of promises aging. And now, a single name had broken through. When she called Linda's mother that night, her voice shook. "We found him," she said. There was a long pause, then soft sobbing, relief and pain tangled together. "Are you sure?" the mother asked. Valdez closed her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. DNA doesn't forget." The sheriff's department mobilized quickly. Warrants, background checks, surveillance. The man they had once interviewed as a footnote was now the center of a storm. Andy Castillo, 56 years old, living 2 counties away. A mechanic. Divorced. No major record beyond minor offenses. The kind of man who smiled politely at neighbors, who waved when he took out the trash. The arrest team arrived at dawn. Castillo didn't resist. Didn't ask why. He just looked at them, confused, then almost amused. In the interrogation room, Valdez sat across from him, the DNA report on the table between them. She watched him carefully, his stillness, the faint curl of a smirk that didn't belong to innocence. "You remember Linda Treviño Carbajal?" she asked. His gaze flickered, just for a second. Then, "Never heard of her." "Eights." She slid a photograph across the table. He didn't look down. "What about Cynthia Palasio?" "Eights." Nothing. Silence pressed between them, thick as the years that had passed. "You've been living free for 17 years, Valdez said quietly. "They've been buried for 17. "Eights." Castillo's jaw tightened. Then he leaned back, smirked again. "I guess that makes us even," he said. The words chilled her. Outside the interrogation room, Pierce, long retired but called in to consult, watched from behind the glass. He was older now, his hair white, his shoulders stooped, but when he saw that smirk, he clenched his fists. He whispered to no one, "You don't get to win." Eights. For the families, the news spread like wildfire. 17 years of waiting, and suddenly there was a face, a name, a body to blame. Linda's mother fell to her knees in her kitchen when the sheriff called. She cried until she couldn't breathe. Then she called Cynthia's parents. "It's over," she said. "It's finally over." Eights. But in truth, it wasn't over. It was only beginning again. The DA's office prepared charges. The press descended on Leech County like vultures. Every headline screamed, "Cold case solved after 17 years." But beneath the celebration was unease, disbelief mingled with exhaustion. For Valdez, the elation lasted only days. Then came the nightmares. The images she'd studied for years, the fields, the dirt roads, the photos, played in her mind, now with a name attached. Knowing who didn't make the memories easier. It made them sharper. Rachel, the lab technician, couldn't shake her own restlessness. She'd rechecked the data so many times she could recite the sequence by heart. Even after confirming everything, part of her feared she'd made a mistake, that somehow, she'd given false hope to families who'd waited too long already. When she drove home that night, she pulled over halfway, parked under a lonely overpass, and cried for the first time in years. Not because of guilt, because of awe. Science had done what time couldn't. Somewhere in those frozen samples, truth had been sleeping, waiting for the world to learn how to listen. And now, it had spoken. By early 2020, the indictment was official. Andy Castillo was charged with 2 counts of murder. Linda's and Cynthia's families sat in the courthouse, holding hands, tears flowing freely. 17 years had ended in a single courtroom whisper. "We got him." Pierce, standing in the back, felt his throat tighten. He thought of every sleepless night, every road driven, every promise whispered to 2 photographs. He closed his eyes and said quietly, "Rest now, girls." Eights. Outside, the news crews waited. Reporters asked if this felt like justice. Linda's mother answered softly, "It feels like knowing." And that's something. Eights. For 17 years, the case had been nothing but ghosts and guesses. Now it had a name, a face, and an ending, though not yet a verdict. But truth, at least, had finally come home. When DNA finally speaks after decades, does that feel like justice? Or just relief? Tell us below. Because every time science solves one of these cold case files, it reminds us that truth may sleep, but it never dies. The morning of the arrest replayed in everyone's minds like a movie they couldn't stop watching. Neighbors remembered the sound first, the knock that wasn't really a knock, more like thunder breaking through the quiet dawn. Police lights spilled across the sleepy cul-de-sac, flashing blue and red against white siding. Inside his modest home, Andy Castillo stood calm as officers entered. No shouting, no panic. Oh, just a slow blink, a faint smirk, as if he'd been expecting this visit all along. The handcuffs clicked shut. Castillo looked down at his wrists, tilted his head, and whispered, finally. 8s. For 17 years, he'd walked among them, grocery store aisles, car repair shops, Sunday services. The invisible man who'd stolen 2 lives and hidden in plain sight. The sheriff's deputies let him out. The neighbors watched in silence, whispering to each other afterward that he looked so normal. 8s. That was the thing about monsters. They rarely looked like the stories warned you about. Detective Marisa Valdez followed the cruiser down the highway, adrenaline still pounding. But under the satisfaction was fear. Fear of losing it all to one technicality. Evidence mishandled. A signature misplaced. A sample questioned. After 17 years, even the smallest mistake could unravel everything. She couldn't afford that. Not now. Not after so long. In the days that followed, Castillo's face was everywhere. Mugshots on TV, headlines online, grainy yearbook photos resurfacing from old archives. Every journalist asked the same question. How did he get away with it for so long? Valdez spent hours studying him during interrogations. He didn't deny or confess. He performed. When asked about the victims, he spoke about himself. How it felt to be accused unfairly. How everyone was overreacting. How his life was being ruined. 8s. He referred to Linda and Cynthia not as people, but as those girls. 8s. The psychologist assigned to evaluate him called it narcissistic detachment, the inability to see others as real. To him, the murders weren't acts of rage. They were trophies of control. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed to prove he could. Valdez noticed how Castillo leaned forward slightly when she mentioned the families. You've caused them 17 years of pain, she said. He smiled faintly. Then I guess I'll live rent-free for another 17. 8s. That smile haunted her for weeks. The district attorney built the case meticulously. DNA at the scene, overlapping timelines, circumstantial connections that formed a chilling mosaic. But a case that old came with risks. Witnesses had moved or died. Memories faded. Physical evidence degraded. Pierce, now fully retired but sitting in the back during prep meetings, warned her quietly, "You'll only get one shot. Don't let him make you doubt." 8s. She nodded, but doubt had already found her. The families arrived early to every hearing, clutching tissues in hope. They sat in the front row, the same way they'd sat in church during the vigils years ago. This time, the candles were gone, replaced by fluorescent courtroom lights that buzzed overhead like insects. You iron the shirt you'll wear to court, palms sweating. You practice what you'll say if he looks at you. You imagine justice as a sound, a gavel striking wood, the end of a long nightmare. Linda's mother carried her daughter's photo in her purse, wrapped in tissue to keep it from bending. Cynthia's father wore his daughter's bracelet on his wrist, the clasp held together with tape. To outsiders, it might have looked like closure in motion, but for those who'd lived it, this wasn't closure. It was confrontation. When Castillo entered the courtroom, shackled, wearing a tan jumpsuit, time seemed to fold in on itself. 17 years melted into one unbearable moment. Linda's mother turned pale. Cynthia's father reached for her hand. Castillo didn't look at them, at first. Then, halfway to his seat, he turned his head slowly, met their eyes, and smiled again. It wasn't a grin of apology or defiance. It was ownership. The kind of smile that said, "I still control the room." The bailiff had to call for order when Linda's sister sobbed aloud. Even Valdez's composure cracked for a second. She'd spent months rehearsing this day in her mind. The arrest, the courtroom, the moment justice would finally breathe. But now, standing feet away from the man who'd haunted so many lives, all she could feel was a chill creeping through her veins. He wasn't the monster of nightmares. He was something worse, ordinary. In pre-trial meetings, Castillo's defense team hinted they might challenge the DNA. Claim contamination, chain of custody errors, lost evidence. Valdez knew the risk. A single lab mistake could collapse everything. The irony was unbearable. Science had delivered the name, but now bureaucracy might undo it. Pierce sat in the gallery for the hearings, sometimes with eyes closed, sometimes whispering to himself. He'd told Valdez once, "The hardest part isn't when you can't find the killer. It's when you finally do, and still have to wait." Eights. The waiting returned now, heavier than before. News vans lined the courthouse steps, broadcasting the story across Texas. Commentators debated guilt, process, ethics. Some called it a triumph of technology. Others warned it was a dangerous precedent. Eights. But inside that courtroom, no one cared about debates. Only about faces, two smiling young women on display beside the prosecutor's desk, their photographs enlarged for the jury to see. They weren't just evidence. They were reminders. The DA's opening statement ended with a line that made the room still. Eights. 17 years ago, two young women were silenced. Today, we give them back their voice. Eights. For a moment, even Castillo stopped smiling. Behind the scenes, Valdez couldn't stop replaying every detail, the timeline, the DNA, the interviews. Every fact had to be perfect. Every signature flawless. If even one mistake surfaced, he'd walk free, and they'd all live that failure forever. When the trial date was set for mid-2021, she drove home in silence. She parked in her driveway, sat there for almost an hour, and finally allowed herself to breathe. The next morning, she got up before dawn, brewed black coffee, and reopened the files again. Old habits die slower than guilt. We break down courtroom turns like these in our Cold Case Files series. Eights. Because the story of Andy Castillo wasn't just about science or evidence, it was about control. He had taken control from his victims, from their families, from the town that feared him. Now, finally, control had shifted. For the first time in 17 years, truth sat on the right side of the table. If you believe predators should never hide behind a normal life, tap subscribe. Because justice delayed isn't justice denied, not when we keep digging through the cold case files that refuse to stay buried. August 27th, 2021. The phone rang just after sunrise. Linda's mother sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd waited through years of silence. Her coffee steamed gently beside her notebook of court dates and notes for her victim statement, pages she'd written and rewritten for months. When she answered, the prosecutor's voice trembled. There's been an incident. Eights. Coffee grows cold in your hand as the word dead unravels 17 years of waiting. Andy Castillo had died overnight in his jail cell. Natural causes, they said. No foul play suspected. The cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the small house like a gunshot, the sound of 17 years collapsing into nothing. For weeks, she had rehearsed what she'd say to him in court. She had pictured the gavel, the sentence, the moment she'd finally look into the eyes of the man who stole her daughter. Now, there would be no trial, no verdict, no moment of reckoning. Just silence. Cynthia's parents heard the news next. They were staying in a motel, ready to attend the trial they had prayed for since 2004. When the call came, they sat on the bed in disbelief. After all the waiting, all the suffering, justice had died quietly in the night beside its target. For the investigators, it felt like a betrayal of time itself. Detective Valdez sat alone in her car outside the station, staring through the windshield at nothing. 17 years of work, evidence, hearings, arrests, ended without closure, without justice formally spoken. She thought of Pierce, the old detective who'd promised the families an ending. She whispered, "We found him, but we didn't finish it." Eights. The sheriff called a press conference that afternoon. Cameras lined the steps. The air felt heavy with disappointment. "Andy Castillo died in custody early this morning," he announced. "The cause of death appears natural. The case will not proceed to trial. But the evidence is clear. We are confident in our findings. These families deserve peace." Eights. His words sounded steady, but his eyes betrayed him. This wasn't peace. It was exhaustion dressed as closure. Reporters pressed for more. Would the case now be considered closed? Would justice ever be complete without a conviction? He hesitated, then said the only thing that could be said. Even incomplete, this marked the end of 2 Texas cold case files. Eights. The phrase echoed like a verdict without weight. In Locke County, the news divided the community. Some said justice had been served, the killer was gone, unable to hurt anyone again. Others said it wasn't enough, that he'd escaped punishment, slipping through the cracks of mortality. At the old church, the families gathered one last time. The candles flickered in the warm Texas wind, just as they had 17 years before. Linda's mother spoke softly into the microphone. "He's gone," she said. "But so is the chance to make him answer. So is the chance to look him in the eye." Eights. She paused, then looked at the crowd. Justice was supposed to speak in that courtroom. Instead, it stayed silent. Eights. The people bowed their heads, not sure whether to pray or rage. For the detectives, the case file was marked closed, a word that felt more like surrender than victory. For the families, it was something else entirely. The ending of a story that had no ending at all. Is naming the killer enough, or does justice need a trial? Comment your thoughts. Because sometimes truth arrives, but justice never catches up. In the months after Castillo's death, silence settled again over Leech County. But this time, it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of reckoning. The trial would never happen, but the story refused to fade. Reporters moved on, but the families, detectives, and townspeople who'd lived inside the case were left to decide what to do with the years they'd lost. Linda's mother found herself sitting at that same kitchen table one morning, staring at the cold stain from the coffee she'd spilled the day she heard the word dead. She could have scrubbed it away, but she didn't. Some marks aren't meant to vanish. Instead, she began writing. Letters, essays, fragments, memories of Linda before the headlines. She wrote about the girl who sang in the kitchen while frying eggs, who loved to dance barefoot in the living room, who once rescued a stray kitten and named it Hope. Her words weren't for justice anymore. They were for remembrance, A local newspaper printed her story. Then another paper picked it up. Soon, people across Texas were reading about Linda Treviño Carbajal not as a victim, but as a daughter, a friend, a life that mattered. Cynthia's father found his own way to fight back against the emptiness. Using his retirement savings, he started a scholarship fund in his daughter's name at the community college she'd once attended. Each year, one young woman studying business received it. Each year, he'd sit in the audience during the awards ceremony, quietly watching their futures begin where his daughters had ended. At the sheriff's office, the cold case board finally came down. But the lesson stayed pinned in every detective's mind. Valdez, now a senior investigator, pushed to overhaul evidence storage procedures. She helped establish 5-year automatic DNA retesting for unsolved homicides, a new state protocol born directly from Linda and Cynthia's case. Their case reshaped how Texas preserves and reopens cold case files statewide. 8. Evidence would no longer gather dust in forgotten freezers. Cases would no longer depend on who happened to remember them. The story became part of Texas law enforcement training, a case study in both tragedy and transformation. New recruits learned the names Carbajal and Palasio the way they learned Miranda rights, not just as legal precedent, but as moral compass. For many detectives, this case became a quiet vow. No more victims waiting decades for science to speak. At the dedication of the memorial plaque in 2022, a small crowd gathered downtown near the park where Linda and Cynthia once spent summer evenings. The bronze plate bore their names, dates, and a simple inscription, 8. Remember them as they lived, not as they died. 8. Valdez stood among the crowd that day, hands clasped behind her back. She saw the two families standing side by side, older, smaller, but still united. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their shared silence said enough. She remembered Pierce's words from years before. Justice incomplete is still justice. Back then, it had sounded hollow. Now, standing beneath the Texas sun, it felt almost true. Because justice wasn't always a verdict. Sometimes, it was a change in policy, in people, in how the world remembers the dead. In the years since, both families found ways to live again. Not to forget, but to coexist with memory. Linda's sister had a daughter and named her Linda Marie. When she held her baby for the first time, she whispered, "You'll grow up safe because of what your aunt taught us." 8. Cynthia's mother still volunteered at the animal shelter, caring for stray dogs like her daughter once did. Every spring, she planted sunflowers in the backyard, the same ones Cynthia had loved. The pain never left, but it changed shape. It became purpose. At the sheriff's office, Valdez kept one framed photo on her desk, not of the victims, not even of the killer, but of the vigil from years ago. Hundreds of candles flickering in the darkness, faces bowed but unbroken. She often told new detectives, "That's what this job is. We hold the light until the next person can see." 8. When recruits asked her how she'd survived 17 years of failure, she said, "You don't survive it. You just keep walking through it." 8. And she did. One day you'll drive past that same road, now paved and still slow down. You'll see the new houses, the trimmed lawns, the children playing where there was once nothing but dirt and sirens. You'll glance toward the trees and remember the yellow tape fluttering in the wind. And though the world has moved on, a small part of you won't. You'll still hear echoes of detectives who refused to quit, of mothers who refused to forget, of science that refused to stay silent. You'll think about how evil once hid here and how truth eventually found it. You'll realize that even imperfect justice can still leave something behind. Awareness, reform, remembrance. You'll whisper their names, not out of sadness, but out of respect. Because in remembering them, you keep their story alive. The story of Linda Treviño Carbajal and Cynthia Joanne Palasio isn't one of closure. It's one of endurance, of how love outlasts violence, and how truth, once uncovered, never really dies again. Their case continues to be cited in training manuals, documentaries, and reform proposals, proof that no murder should be left behind a file label, no family left waiting for science to catch up. Justice didn't come on schedule, but it came, and that was enough to change everything. If you want us to keep spotlighting reforms born from real cold case files, tap the bell. Because when we remember these stories, we don't just honor the past, we protect the future. By spring, the air in Leech County carried the same scent of mesquite and dust as it had in 2004. But something was different now. Not in the land, in the people. The memorial plaque stood quietly in the park, bronze catching the sun, names gleaming like tiny anchors in time. Linda Treviño Carbajal, Cynthia Joanne Palasio. Life had moved forward, as it always does. But beneath the rhythm of ordinary days, school bells, engines starting, church bells on Sunday, their story lingered. Not as tragedy anymore, but as testimony. Detective Valdez still passed the old road on her commute. Every time, she slowed down without meaning to, eyes tracing the curve where gravel met asphalt. She never forgot the first time she'd driven that stretch, sirens wailing, adrenaline spiking, the taste of fear in her mouth. Now, 20 years later, the same stretch of road whispered a different kind of message. One about persistence. One about patience. Linda's mother sometimes visited the park in the evenings, when the light softened and the cicadas began their low hum. She'd bring flowers, not lilies anymore, but bright daisies, Linda's favorite. Sometimes she sat alone. Sometimes strangers joined her for a quiet moment. The world had learned her daughter's name. That mattered. Cynthia's father had passed the scholarship to the next generation. Dozens of young women had already benefited, the legacy of one life building dozens of others. He used to say, "Grief is a weight, but if you lift it high enough, it becomes a bridge." Eights. For the detectives who once chased ghosts through empty fields, this case had become more than a file. It was a lesson carved into their bones about the cost of time, the power of science, and the human need for answers. They still spoke about it when training new recruits, reminding them that evidence is not just data, it's a promise to the dead. In the end, truth itself became the only justice these cold case files could deliver. Eights. No verdict, no sentencing, just truth. Cold, clear, and permanent. And somehow, that had to be enough. Years later, if you drive through northern Leech County, you wouldn't know what happened there unless someone told you. The dirt road is paved now, lined with young trees and mailboxes. Children race bicycles down the sidewalk. Laughter fills the air where once there was silence. But if you listen carefully, you might still feel it, the echo of sirens long gone, the hush of investigators standing over a field, the heartbeat of a town that refused to forget. You might pass the small bronze plaque downtown and notice two names you don't recognize. You might stop for a moment. You might read. And maybe you'll remember them, not as victims, but as the reason we keep asking, keep testing, keep believing that even in the coldest files, truth still breathes. If it were your town, would the truth be enough to sleep or just enough to keep going. Comment your country and the time right now. Subscribe to follow our Cold Case Files stories every week, where truth, no matter how late, still finds a voice. And share this story, so Linda and Cynthia are never forgotten.